Hello, everyone. Greetings from Ahval. I'm Yavuz Baydar. This is Hot Pursuit. Today, we will follow the money and try to map the organized crime. Um, as some saying goes in the TV series The Wire, if you follow the money in such a domain, you never know where you end up. And it's what we try to talk about today. We will speak about we'll have a conversation about the mafia penetration into the structures of the Turkish state, corruption, growing decay in the current administration led by President Erdogan, the lackeys surrounding the palace with alleged involvement in the current schemes of money laundering and smuggling allegations and all that. In short, perhaps mafiaization of the state, mafiaization of the Turkish state. I have two prominent guests with me, two top experts. One of them is Ryan Gingeras, professor in the Department of National Security Affairs in Naval Postgraduate School in California, expert on Turkey, Balkans, and Middle East in terms of history, but in this context, as expert on organized crime. Welcome, Ryan.
Thanks so much for having me, Yavuz, as always.
Thank you. Good to be with you too. And my second guest is Aykan Erdemir, Senior Director of Turkey Program with Foundation of Defense of Democracies based in Washington, D.C. Good to be with you, Aykan, too.
Thank you for having me. Great to be here.
Okay, so there is a lot happening now in what we are going to be speaking about. It's sort of triggered by the videos recorded and published by Sedat Peker, a prominent mob figure in Turkey. And he's tossing around accusations and half revealing some stories about massive cocaine smuggling in Turkey, murder stories, and I think most important of all, the name dropping, which places Mehmet Ağar, a former figure, often depicted as a major figure of the Turkish deep state, a former minister of interior, his son, Tolga Ağar, also a deputy with the AKP, deputy of Elazığ, where the Ağar family is from, and many other figures, of course. And this also is a good reason for us to sort of recap and talk about the partial amnesty, which led to another mob figure, Çakıcı, Alaaddin Çakıcı, being released after a series of pleadings by Bahçeli, Devlet Bahçeli, leader of the nationalist MHP party. And the rivalry between these two top figures, Peker and Çakıcı, and also in the background, a lot, of course, Azeri figures like Mansimov, Marina Yalıkavak in Bodrum, many other things, many other components that we perhaps need to read into and speak about. Ryan, you have seen parts of it, at least these now three videos. How should we read into this latest rantings, if we may call them so?
Yeah, I've read. I've watched parts of them. I've read summaries of them all, including the most recent one. I think at the very least, the most important thing to keep in mind is that Sedat Peker is a creature of the media. And this has always been, I think, perhaps his most defining characteristic as a luminary of Turkish underworld politics, organized crime type, sort of that type of intersection. I think that he has always prided himself on the fact that he claims to know a lot and that he's willing to talk about, at least selectively, the things that he's supposedly privy to. And that I think this episode in particular sort of reminds me quite a bit of his appearance before the court during the Ergenekon trials, in which he was the most vocal, in which he ostensibly, was kind of recapturing a lot of one of the things that he said then, which is, yes, I know what's going on in the state. Yes, I'm willing to name this person and that person who have done nefarious things. And a part of it is to deflect attention from himself and whatever his own activities are. And I think one thing that to add in your summary, Yavuz, is that he supposedly was the focal point of a rather expansive operation recently in Istanbul that netted scores of people who were supposedly attached to him, who were charged with a variety of different crimes, most of them having actually very little to do with what I would otherwise call sort of big money type organized crime activities. I mean, it was kidnapping or burglary or bribery, or more broadly speaking, belonging to a criminal gang, which we get to maybe a bit later as kind of a blanket term, blanket charge used in a lot of these operations, which obscures more than it really helps understand what's going on.
Right.
And I think that broadly speaking, I think I think his MO is to speak to the media, sort of stir up a lot of attention away from himself and towards others, and particularly with those involved in political circles. Whether that's has any validity or not is really hard to say.
I mean, he talks a lot, and as you say, he loves being public,
Yes.
and loudly so. But he talks a lot because obviously he knows a lot, or shall we say the opposite? What do you think?
I think you have to take him with a lot of salt.
Pinch of salt.
Yeah, more than a pinch. I mean, I think we have to be honest that he, 15 years ago, he participated in the Ergenekon trials, in which he was the most talkative amongst these sort of former luminaries in organized crime, in which he specifically cast accusations towards people like Veli Küçük and others who were high up, sort of long sort of associated with the idea of deep state activity. And I think this should be looked at as, perhaps maybe somewhat valid, insofar as that it's possible that Veli Küçük, most likely was involved in lots of nefarious things. But whether the specific charges levied by Sedat Peker are true are really not known, especially given the fact that the basis of this case was based on a great deal of fabrication and a great deal of unsubstantiated claims. So I think, looking at some of the specific charges or specific claims that he makes in these videos, I'm a little bit skeptical. But I think, it's more than anything is kind of, I think, the nature of how a lot of crime is generally sort of discussed and perceived in the country, is that every now and then you have somebody who comes out and reveals some sort of grand, subplot within the development of organized crime, and then people move on.
Let's stay on this one, Aykan. What does these videos tell us? I mean, let's specifically focus on this one, the latest development.
Now, first of all, I think the overall framework is Sedat Peker is highlighting just a subset of a range of pretty substantiated rumors that many people around Turkey have been aware of for quite a while. So, some people call this episode the second Susurluk. Susurluk being that early traffic accident, which by accident exposed the fact that Turkey's security establishment was hand in hand with mafia, mobsters and drug dealers.
And organized crime.
And organized crime. And this one is called now a second Susurluk, because in a way, and back then too, what Susurluk exposed was not news, meaning most people who follow Turkey closely, back in the 1990s when, people referred to Turkey's war against the PKK as the dirty war, because all sorts of interests got mixed in, security interests of the state, mobster and organized crime interests, drug, kingpins interests, versus today, when again, people know that all sorts of interests have intertwined, organized crime, government's political survival needs, drug dealing, as well as, the war on terror. So in a way, I think one key message out of this video is not much has changed, meaning individuals and organizations might have reshuffled, but ultimately, just like the first Susurluk, in this second so-called Susurluk, we again see that it's not even, organized crime penetration of the state. I think, Ryan is in a much better position as a historian here to speak about these things, but
we will get into that. But I think
if you would excuse me,
Sure.
what I would like to say is what we see today is pretty much the quite standard MO of the way in which politics has always functioned in Turkey, meaning this is not a organized crime penetrating the state at a later stage, but this is, since even the Committee of Union and Progress days, since the late Ottoman times, political violence, certain forms of criminal activity, whether for self-gain or for political gain, have worked hand in hand with ruling circles, with the security establishment, as well as with, let's say, the intel community, as well as what's now called the deep state. So what we see today is just, I would argue, the latest episode of what has been a pattern of almost a century and more. I'm not arguing that this has always been the same story throughout. Of course, it's, let's say, unfolding in different ways. Maybe. But yes, there is a leitmotif here, and Sedat Peker and the company. This is just the latest reiteration of a century-long story.
I wanted to intervene and put it in a interesting context. You mentioned Susurluk, 1996, November. Who was the Minister of Interior? It was Ahmet Ağar. And he resigned. And who became the Minister of Interior? Ms. Meral Akşener, who is now leading the E Party. So all these figures are, as you say, it's like a deja vu situation in a different time. But most of these figures are still there in the same stage. Whatever you may want to call it, that's that kind of play. The playbook maybe is the same, maybe is not changed. Maybe Ryan can give us bring us into more historic perspective in it. But in this one, as before, I think worth to note that yes, there was a dirty war, and there's a dirty war now going on. Also, the second element is, of course, the increasing rapprochement between, not rapprochement, but sort of getting close between Azerbaijan, the Azeri regime, and Ankara regime. And there's also, in a corner somewhere, North Cyprus, again, as part of the minor, or in middle of the layer figures are operating. So it's an interesting, also Mansimov, the famous figure, and Yalıkavak Marina, and all of these things. So stages may be the same, but playbook has been updated, let's say, in a way. Maybe, do you agree, Ryan? Ryan Gingeras, by the way, for the viewers, is the author of the book Heroin, Organized Crime, and the Making of the Modern Turkey. Very interesting title. Much talked about book again these days. It was much talked about book when it was published in 2014. So, Brian, this is, I think, a good time to put everything in historic context. The
Sure.
patterns mentioned by Icon.
I want to revisit something that Icon talked about, which is this idea that these videos somehow represent a second scissor and the idea of what this means in terms of continuity to the past. I think, perhaps for the benefit of the viewers, it's important maybe to break down specific aspects of these videos, specific charges, and sort of place it perhaps a little bit more in context. And I think, number one, I think Scissorlook in itself, I think Icon's absolutely right. It did confirm largely a thing or a pattern that many people suspected, but it did so in a very concrete way, which is the most fundamental aspect of the 1996 revelations around Scissorlook was, number one, the personal interaction between elements of the government, elements of the security establishment, and people involved in organized crime. That's number one. But number two, and this is where Mehmet Ağar, former interior minister, former head of the national police, step in, the fact that he personally provided, always break on his name, the
Chatla?
Chatla, thank you, Abdullah
Yes.
Chatla.
Abdullah Chatla, yes.
Abdullah Chatla, who I always get Alatin Çakıcı and Abdullah Chatla. I always want to put them together, merge them.
And also, for the viewers, we should just mention who Chatla is. He's a famous hitman, and also described always as part of the deep state structure.
Right. So, I mean, Abdullah Chatla is found dead alongside several other individuals in this automobile, who, again, one is a member of parliament who also was a paramilitary leader, and the other was a police captain from Istanbul. So, I mean, this trifecta of individuals sort of begged attention. Number two, the fact that in the car was a passport that was signed by Mehmet Ağar, that was essentially a passport provided to Abdullah Chatla, despite the fact that he had an international arrest warrant out in his name for drug trafficking, as well as escaping from prison in France, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a really different kind of revelation than I think what these revelations are, which are many, but among the chief ones is, number one, the accusation that Mehmet Ağar's son was involved in a sexual assault and perhaps murder, and that Mehmet Ağar was complicit in was complicit in a conspiracy to import somewhere around 5 tons of cocaine into Turkey. Now,
from Colombia.
From Colombia. Now, I think compared to sort of past revelations related to organized crime, I think more than anything, I think it reflects, regardless of their validity, whether these charges are true, is that people who run in relatively elite circles talk, they share gossip, and Sedat Peker is more than willing to share that gossip publicly. I think the cocaine charge is pretty interesting, at the very least, whether Mehmet Ağar has anything to do with it or not. Insofar as that I don't believe that there has ever been as large amount of cocaine ever discovered
Right.
in Turkey. This is somewhat unprecedented. We've had really large, for example, heroin shipments that have been discovered, also sort of having various nefarious political connections. For example, the famous Kismet Bir case.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you about, because in the
Yeah, I mean,
background, there is heroin in that one. But now in this background, there is cocaine not shipped to Turkey, but captured, seized just before the shipment in Colombia,
right.
and
So
also Ecuador, also 600, 700 kilos more after the Colombian thing. Anyway, back to you.
that's that's rather surprising, since I think the historical pattern in cocaine trafficking, although this is somewhat dated. Things, perhaps have changed greatly. It's difficult to say, especially given the pandemic. But there have been cocaine seizures historically in Turkey, but they're very small, and a lot of it comes via Africa. So the idea of these direct shipments, if they were indeed bound for Turkey, that's somewhat interesting. It's difficult to place it in context, though. But I think in the broad scheme of things, what I take from it in terms of the idea of continuity or discontinuity with the past is that, when I wrote, my book on heroin and organized crime in the making of Turkey in, the late 2000s, early 2000 teens, Turkey was a very different country, in which we could have had, or at least one was led to believe, that Turkey had really changed in terms of its approach towards organized crime. And the evidence of this was a far more active and internationally engaged police department, state police department on
Right.
matters of organized crime, and
Closer cooperation between DEA and MASAK, the Turkish financial crimes unit.
But with Europol,
Right.
with international policing organizations, Turkey was a leader, not simply active as a partner. Added to that Erdogan, in coming to power, came to power with the promise of greater transparency, greater competency, and doing away with this idea of corruption. So I think, one thing that this particular revelation would seem to suggest is that there, sort of at the high sort of end of Turkish society, there is a lot of corruption. There is a lot of nefarious dealings that go on, in which the police either look the other way or not even involved, and that there is a sort of a selective prosecution of criminals. Because a lot of what's sort of feeding this is that, again, Sedat Peker has been the focus of police attention.
Mhm.
And I think that what this seems like more to me, and I think what he is really often driving at in these videos, is that there is a tension. There is greater tension among various factions in support of the government, and that this represents a kind of political jockeying among these various factions.
So is it a turf war?
I think it's I'd be interested in hearing Icon's view of this. This seems, if there's a connection with scissor, is that there is a political dimension in that Peker and Ar and Alatin Çakıcı, sort of liminal to all of this. These are all people who have really strong credentials as nationalists, ultra-nationalists, people who have been, really deep roots in the ultra-nationalist movement in the country.
Mm-hmm.
In this day and age, the ultra-nationalists, like in MHP, as well as other factions, have, political influence that really is almost unprecedented in contemporary Turkish politics. And yet, as Icon foreshadowed, the government is quite weak, and it is in distress at present. So perhaps this is some sort of, not necessarily, I don't know if turf war is necessarily the right word. It seems to be some kind of political jockeying going on in general, in which, fundamentally Sedat Peker is a political animal. I mean, more than, yes, he's been involved in crime, but I think he is a much more potent figure, perhaps as a political figure, considering that his historic ties to the MHP, to the Grey Wolves, and what he sort of means within that whole movement.
Aykan, what's your take?
Now, I think there are a couple of long-term trends playing out simultaneously here. I'll start with the most general one, and that is, for years, many Turkish liberals argued that Turkey has a very strong state and not strong enough civil society, so this asymmetry led to a lot of problems. So people like me who are neo-institutionalists, we have always argued Turkey has a weak state, very weak state, and a strong society. What I mean is, strong society does not mean strong civil society. What we have been arguing is Turkey has a very brutal state apparatus, but a very weak state institutions.
Yeah.
And then society, whether it's tribes, religious orders, hemşire, this provincial, solidarity networks, they have exerted enormous influence over the workings of the state. So there was not an autonomous, competent, functioning state apparatus. So with Erdogan, at a time when people believe the state is at its strongest because it's at its most brutal, we have seen actually a complete deinstitutionalization, a complete hollowing out of the Turkish state. So this is, I think, the one big story we see here. That
from about 2014 on, or 2013 on.
Yes. So now what we have is a complete collapse of the state's institutional capacity and a complete tribalization, as well as organized crime, turf wars and control of the so-called state apparatus.
And the judiciary,
all of the law enforcement, all of the law enforcement playing field. So that's the one big story here, I think. So, and it will get worse, meaning the more Turkey's state capacity is undermined, and the more Erdogan assumes he is consolidating one-man rule, what we will continue to see is, I think, more of such episodes.
Yes.
The second big story here is, again, I'll say follow the money, but pay attention to the money itself, because ultimately the cake is shrinking. So, which means at a time when we're trying to follow the money, but the money is getting less and less, especially, think about it. The total wealth in Turkish liras has lost over 50% of its value in dollar terms, in real terms, over the last 3 years. So the cake that Turkey is trying to share today is almost at its smallest, which means this is not only a horrible development for the poor, people on the ground who are below poverty rate, but this is also horrible for the organized crime syndicates and as well as Erdogan's inner circle, that have to find new ways of, resharing the slices of this cake. So that's the second big story. And the third one, and I'm not as confident as the first two ones, because the first two ones are major trends that we can see. But the third one is more a speculation or a question on my part. And that is, there was one interesting detail in Peker's video where, as Ryan said, many of these gangs are ultra-nationalist, right? They're all connected to ülkücüs, the Grey Wolves, to, idealist hearts, to the MHP and so on and so forth. But
fiercely anti-Kurdish as well.
Yes, fiercely anti-Kurdish. But there, Peker kept on emphasizing, we are against Russia and China as well. So he's trying to set himself apart from what he calls the ulusalcı. He even refers to the Perinçek group. He says, we have been against the US, he's critical of the US, but he said, just like Turkish, the founding father of Turkey, is ultranationalism. We have always been against, Russian and Chinese imperialism too. So he seems to be a little puzzled that the current regime is looking toward Russia and China as a new path, and Peker is having a difficult time putting that together with his own brand of ultranationalism. So the question I have here is, I know often the first two trends matter more, but are we also seeing here some fault lines as to ultranationalist organized crime gangs and the way they position themselves politically, and not just domestic politics wise, but international politics wise, as Turkey seems to be shifting from, let's say, the Cold War era, when ultranationalists were aligned with NATO and, let's say, the United States in its anti-communist outlook, to a new era when there is a new Turkey in the making that is pro-Russia, pro-China, pro-Iran, pro-Venezuela, is completely disconnecting from the Western sphere of influence. And why this matters, you might ask, why should it matter to an organized crime gang, right? Whether Turkey is...
Why should he need to profile himself through analyzing it this way? Yes.
Yeah. Again, I don't have an answer here, but I have one question. Look, just pure self-interest could dictate that Turkey in the Western orbit, Turkey in the Western sphere, is a much larger cake to divide. Turkey in the Russian, Chinese, Iranian orbit, yes, it might open up some more space for transactions with some of this new illicit affairs. Like there is more money in sanctions busting, in money laundering, maybe in that new space. But at the same time, to be frank, a Turkey that is looking to authoritarianism and to the East will inevitably be a Turkey with a smaller cake to divide. Now, this is not I'm not pushing that this is also an important part of the story, but that fault line that emerged in the middle of all this personal vendetta is also interesting, that someone like Peker is also complaining about some major geostrategic shifts that is taking place in Turkey. And I simply wanted to also highlight that as an interesting tidbit.
Okay. Do you agree, Ryan?
First of all, I think all the points that Aykan just raised are all critical, and I think have an immense amount of validity. And I think this third point that you raised, I think is really interesting. I would interpret it this way, though. Sedat Peker, alongside someone like Alaaddin Çakıcı, are the last of their kind. They are essentially dinosaurs in terms of the old institutions of organized crime in Turkey, right? These are individuals who pride themselves as being, kabadaya, being these sorts of honorable, sort of fixers, tough guys, businessmen, who, are more than anything, they're sort of the way in which they conceive themselves, in which they sort of fit within the broader narrative of Turkey, is that they are preservers of social order, right? And that has always been the ways in which they have engaged media and have talked about themselves in the context of Turkey. And so the crime aspect is married to the political aspect insofar as that as ultranationalists, they believe the precepts of something more along the lines of an MHP ultranationalism is the bedrock of Turkish society. So, I think Sedat Peker is obviously, loves political exposure, and he wants to be relevant. After all, we know that Sedat Peker is not into drugs, but relevance is probably the most addictive drug of them all, right? And he went in a space of 10 years from being politically irrelevant in prison to being someone who was on the national stage, who attained national notoriety on the basis of campaigning for the AKP and for what seemed like his personal attachment to Erdogan himself. That's a pretty remarkable reversal of fortune. I would say, to go sort of specifically to what these political comments mean, I would say that for someone like him, current events are difficult to swallow because, number one, it means that someone like him is getting pushed further and further to the political margins, or more politically disposable, given the fact that I think, Aykan, you're right, there is a sort of wider universe of organized crime activity that is far more important nowadays than in the past. You mentioned sanctions busting, money laundering. These are things that he, as far as we know, and we actually, to tell you the truth, we know very little about his criminal career, his criminal background, right, how he fits into the wider universe of organized crime. We know very, very little. And that, frankly, and I think this actually goes, to footstomp Aykan's first point, Turkey is historically a very weak state. It is also an exceedingly clientelistic state. It is among the elements that really underscore this fact is that when it comes to the prosecution of crime, the role of the prosecutor oftentimes obscures the crime itself more than it actually reveals anything about the crime, right? And this is especially the case when it comes to organized crime. Most organized criminals are not necessarily tried for specific crimes. They are tried for belonging to criminal gangs with not necessarily specified criminal activity. And there is rarely a forensic portrayal, either in the media or in the prosecutorial procedures, of what a person does to arrive at the position of being in a criminal gang. That would be only the case if somebody was actually caught, for example, transporting goods, or who is specifically accused of, let's say, some sort of physical harm, or if they are found with weapons on them. But we don't get, if we're going to use the wire analogy, we don't have, a lot of criminal cases where there is a detailed accounting of someone's financial or criminal behavior based on an impartial recording of fact. You don't have it. Right. So I think for his perspective, to kind of circle back to what do we make of all of this, I think this is I think in the grand scheme of things, this is the floundering of a person whose day is coming to an end. And he is perhaps, and again, this is all highly speculative, perhaps shedding light on, I think, kind of this ongoing issue in Turkey of a kind of inter-elite competition for political influence and inter-elite corrupt behavior that the state has always struggled with. And I think that Aykan is right there, that there's always been sort of this problem that Turkey has at times done better with than others, but always had this problem of how do you police the very powerful?
Mm-hmm. Let's wrap it up because it's been 40 minutes. We don't want to bore the viewers or listeners, but there are a couple of questions. Briefly, if you will, Ryan, as Aykan pointed out, as you agreed, Turkey as a state, as its perhaps weakest at the moment, which makes it a very vulnerable state for external penetration. And it is also, as widely agreed by economists, a bankrupt state at the moment. Um, One also does think and wonder whether or not, as we know from Iran Gate, as we know from 1990s Turkey, there is always a correlation between hard drugs smuggling and dirty war. And one does think, of course, and wonder whether or not this is a lot of money, this 5 tons of cocaine, maybe more, we don't know yet, was already smuggled in. A lot of money. And is it possible to think that this is maybe at this weakest point that state finds itself is being channeled into financing sort of cross-border operations, military operations, etc., especially in Kurdish parts and also domestic operations? Because we saw the emergence or re-rise of the resurge of the paramilitary structures as well in Turkey in the past 5, 6, 7 years.
I don't know. I mean, I'd like to see more reporting on this cocaine story before we can really say what's going on. And okay. I don't know. I mean, I just don't. I don't know if I could.
Maybe it's too premature to talk about. And I can. What about the sort of oligarchs are involved in this picture, in the broader picture? Azeri oligarchs, Mansimov, etc., Yalikavak, Marina. What can we say anything about this? Put it in a context at the moment, or is it also premature?
No, I think one interesting part here is some earlier reporting has been confirmed. Because Peker says, Mansimov has been, bankrolling basically the ruling circle, including the R circle, including carrying
Mansimov,
people.
by the way, Mansimov, excuse me for the viewers, Mansimov is a former Red Army officer rising on the sort of, Aliyev clan's rise already before the collapse of the Soviet structure, and also become a very powerful figure, a lot of lawlessness surrounding him, and then became involved in, affairs in Turkey with the Turkey's, some dark figures of Turkey, etc. So please go on.
But the moral of the story is that someone who has been extremely generous to both the Erdogan inner circle as well as to Mehmet Ağar's inner circle suddenly found himself as being accused of being a member of FETÖ, the Gülenist terrorist organization. And here too, Peker says Ağar was the person who introduced Mansimov to Gülen, and then he stabbed him in the back and, put him in prison for being a Gülenist. Now, the moral of the story here is at a time when the pool is shrinking, and when alliances are reshuffled, loyalties are reshuffled every day, there seems to be a lot of backstabbing and reversal of fortunes. And at a time when there's a complete collapse of due process and rule of law, meaning now that's a very scary story for Erdogan's inner circle, because when you're desperate for funds, anyone who has had access to billions and billions of dollars of spoils now can find themselves in Mansimov's place, meaning this is the time when the ruling clique needs those funds. Your resources could be tapped into. You can be criminalized overnight, and you can suddenly become a PKK terrorist or a Gülenist terrorist, and you can lose your wealth, you can lose your freedom. So that's one very interesting aspect of the new era. And another detail which I paid attention is how maybe now Lebanon might become a good paradigm to understand Turkey. Now, this is quite a radical statement. That is, Lebanon under Hezbollah control and becoming a narco state is now resembling Turkey, or Turkey is now resembling Lebanon in some respects, because now we are also seeing how people in the law enforcement system appears to be using a lot of those advantages, control of the police, control of the customs, control of the ports and marinas, control of the judiciary, allegedly to facilitate these huge narco deals, like narco trade deals. Now, that's very interesting, especially when we connect it to another detail Peker alleges. He said Turkey donated armed drones to Morocco to ensure his extradition, but it failed. Now, this is really a new frontier. It's like the state is not only involved in narco trade or even human trafficking for all sorts of reasons, but it's now there's a complete, let's say, overlap of the core national security issues, such as who gets armed drones built by Turkey, built by the president's son-in-law, and how some other organized crime deals are settled. That is extradition of Peker. So that, I think, is really a new episode in Turkey's descent into like complete lawlessness. That's why I'm bringing in Lebanon, like as a narco state taken to a great extent by Hezbollah, taken over to a great extent by Hezbollah, as a paradigm which might begin to make more and more sense as a comparison to Turkey, to understanding Turkey, because just to end this with two-sentence commentary, Turkey, in a similar way, appears to be more and more in the grasp of these special political, paramilitary, organized crime interests and state capacities, institutional capacities appear to be quite easily tapped into for a whole range of criminal activities, from drug trafficking to human trafficking. And most recently, there was the episode of using official Turkish passports systematically to basically smuggle human smuggling into the European Union. So that is, I think, a really very dark path for Turkey.
Well, all we are talking about is the growing and accelerating decay, actually. Ryan, anything to add to this, to what Aykan says?
I don't want to take too much time. I think really briefly, I don't know if Lebanon's a really good analogy, because the fundamental aspect of Lebanon is that by definition, it is a state with really diluted divisions of power, and that organized crime in Lebanon, specifically smuggling, has been a key part of Lebanese politics long before there was a Hezbollah. And that there is, in many ways, it sort of speaks to the balkanization or the various fiefdoms that one finds not only in the Lebanese landscape, sort of social and political landscape, but also in the government itself. Turkey doesn't have that kind of innate factionalization. I think, looking at, again, the video and looking at it as a milestone for where we are or where we're going, I think conservatively, what it seems like is we are at a point where the government is obviously appearing very weak. People who are otherwise quite strong proponents of the government, people who are actually really singularly associated with, both politically as well as ideologically, and one could say even sort of socially, so strongly connected to the government, are now peeling back. And I think in this regard, Peker is someone who I think is shedding more of a light on the fact that people sense that the kind of the larger sort of constellations of different factions in Ankara are turning against themselves, and he's using a medium that I think a lot of Turks are already attuned to as the greatest source of revelation, which is social media. I was thinking about looking at the video this morning of Fuat Avni, I was thinking about the videos that were released in 2015 regarding the the wiretapping of Erdogan and others within the elite circle. And I think that the Turkish public kind of has an innate trust of social media as being the true purveyor, the real purveyors of truth.
Mm-hmm. Interesting you mentioned that. The first part of Sedat Peker feuilleton was followed as of this morning by 1,100,000 approximately. Second, 1,700,000. Second part apparently more interesting, and the third part was as of again this morning 400,000. So it looks like the highest rating with the cheapest possible production cost. So it's an excellent project actually to reach out.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's people, I think, why we're talking about this, I'll be honest, I would have probably never really paid much attention to this. Because I think that this, to my mind, whether the actual accusations are true or not, I don't know in the grand scheme if it's necessarily true. I think the real significance is that it shows a sign of real insecurity in political circles.
Sure.
And I think that looking ahead, yeah, I mean, it's hard not to be pessimistic, especially as you see kind of even wider jockeying at much more senior levels between, let's say, Süleyman Soylu,
right,
as well as in
Bahçeli
within the cabinet, looking for ultimately a post-Erdogan era, what's going to happen. And I think this is much more of a kind of downstream manifestation of those sorts of tensions.
That is the reason why we are talking. We were conversing about this. One final question briefly, Aykan, to you. As we look at, this is an episode that is again, reminiscent of what we see as the, historically speaking, to Turkish Republic. It seems every 20 years it goes tilt, basically. If we take from 60 to 1980, we see growing decay of political class and a bureaucratic class, including civilian or military. It goes tilt again from 80 to to 1990s. It goes tilt again. From we have seen 20 years of AKP rule. Again, it seems to go to basically to says error. So is it these kind of dark periods of decay, corruption, is that part of a sort of vicious circle as a rule rather than exception?
One could even say, ironically, that you would take a vicious circle over what's happening here. This is more like continuous decay in the sense that the stakes are getting higher, meaning institutional decay is deepening, meaning hollowing out of institutions is a growing trend. That's one. The second issue is today's Turkish economy is much more difficult to resuscitate compared to the relatively closed economy of the 1960s, in the sense that the amount of hot money inflows the Turkish economy and Turkish way of life are dependent on is in no way comparable to the tiny amounts of the 1960s and 70s. So when I say the stakes are high at this point, what I'm saying is with each collapse that you have referred to, now we are in a position to end up with a greater institutional and societal turmoil. Second, a greater economic and financial cost, not just in terms of the impoverishment of the average Turkish citizen, but in the complete collapse of the financial and business system, which are all interconnected, not just only within Turkey, but with over $100 billion of exposure by the European banks alone. So it's almost like what you refer to as a vicious circle is becoming this even greater swings of the pendulum with even greater capacity to self-destruct at home and with greater spillover effects to the Western world. And for me, the moral of the story is the next Turkish collapse will not only be a Turkish tragedy, but it will also be a massive toxic decay that spills over to the neighborhoods. So all those who have been appeasing the Erdogan regime with the hopes that, this can simply be contained within Turkey, will now have to experience all the negative spillovers from this long list of, mess that we have been discussing. So I would say buckle up and brace for the impact.
On those excellently gloomy notes, let's end up here our conversation about decay and mafiaization, as some would say, of the Turkish state due to latest developments. Thank you, Aykan Erdemir, Senior Director of Turkey Program with Foundation of Defense of Democracies based in Washington, D.C., and Professor Ryan Gingeras, at the Department of National Security Affairs, Naval Postgraduate School in California. Thank you, gentlemen, for this conversation.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for having
Thank
me.
you very much.